Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to the shadowed halls of one of Jujutsu society's most distinguished and damned bloodlines. Tonight, we descend into the tragic chronicle of the Zenin clan, whose ancient power was built upon foundations of cruelty, tradition twisted into tyranny, and blood purity pursued at the cost of humanity itself. This is a story of souls crushed beneath the weight of impossible expectations, of love perverted into possession, and of a family that chose might over mercy until mercy struck back with devastating finality. So settle into comfortable darkness. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of cursed energy flowing through corrupted bloodlines, and allow yourself to drift as we trace the rise and fall of a clan that forgot what it meant to be human. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let the infinite void of sleep embrace you as we explore the beautiful, terrible tragedy of the Zenin legacy. The origins of the Zenin clan stretch back through centuries of Japanese history, their roots intertwining with the very foundations of organized Jujutsu society, like poisonous vines that grew stronger with each passing generation. In the misty depths of the Heian period, when curses roamed the earth with unprecedented freedom and the boundaries between the supernatural and mundane worlds were gossamer thin, three families emerged from the chaos with power sufficient to impose order through overwhelming force. The Zenin were among these founding pillars, their cursed techniques so formidable that their very existence reshaped the landscape of spiritual warfare. The early Zenin were not yet the rigid traditionalists who would define their later reputation, but survivors who understood that strength was the only currency that mattered in a world where failure meant not just personal death, but the extinction of entire bloodlines. Their ancestral home in the mountains outside Kyoto became a fortress where the secrets of cursed energy manipulation were refined through generations of careful study and ruthless application. The techniques they developed during this formative period would become the foundation of their power and ultimately the source of their corruption. The Ten Shadows technique, which would later be considered the pinnacle of Zenin inheritance, was perfected through centuries of trial and experimentation that cost countless lives among both practitioners and their enemies. The ability to summon and control Shikigami through shadow manipulation required not just enormous reserves of cursed energy, but a particular mindset that could impose absolute dominance over forces that possessed their own will and Balian intelligence. This technique became more than a combat ability for the Zenin. It became a metaphor for their entire approach to existence. The belief that true strength came from the capacity to bend others completely to one's will. The clan's early interactions with the other founding families established patterns of competition and cooperation that would define Jujutsu society for centuries to come. With the Gojo clan, they maintained a relationship of mutual respect, tempered by underlying tension, understanding that both families possessed techniques so powerful that open warfare between them would devastate the entire supernatural community. The Kamo clan provided a model for how ancient bloodlines could maintain their purity and power through careful breeding practices and political maneuvering that kept inferior lineages in their proper subordinate positions. But it was during the Edo period that the philosophical framework, which would ultimately destroy the Zenin, began to crystallize into the rigid doctrine that would govern every aspect of their existence. The long peace that characterized this era allowed them to turn their attention inward, developing theories about bloodline purity and inherited superiority that transformed practical considerations about cursed technique development into religious conviction about their fundamental superiority over ordinary humans and lesser, sorcerer families. The isolation that came with their mountain stronghold contributed to the development of increasingly extreme interpretations of what it meant to be a true member of the Zenin bloodline. Cut off from the moderating influences of regular interaction with the outside world, the clan developed customs and beliefs that reflected their growing conviction that they were not merely powerful humans but representatives of a superior form of existence that was destined to rule over those too weak to govern themselves. Effectively, the practice of arranged marriages within the clan and with carefully selected partners from other sorcerer families began during this period, initially as a practical measure to ensure that cursed techniques would be passed to future generations without dilution from inferior bloodlines. What started as strategic breeding gradually evolved into something approaching a religious ritual, the belief that the mixing of powerful bloodlines could produce offspring whose abilities transcended anything that individual families could achieve through their own resources. The women of the Zenin clan during this formative period existed primarily as vessels for the continuation of superior genetic material, their individual desires and capabilities subordinated to the larger project of maintaining and enhancing the family's cursed energy inheritance. The degradation of women from partners to property was not accomplished through single dramatic policy changes, but through the gradual accumulation of customs and expectations that made their objectification seem natural and inevitable. The clan's growing wealth and political influence during the Edo period allowed them to construct the elaborate compound that would serve as their seat of power for centuries to come. Every aspect of its design reflected their values and priorities. Training grounds where children learned that mercy was weakness, meeting halls where the family hierarchy was reinforced through seating arrangements and speaking protocols, and private quarters where the most powerful members could indulge their appetites without concern for the consequences to those who lacked the strength to resist. The philosophical texts that were produced during this period by Zenin scholars and strategists provided intellectual justification for practices that might otherwise have been recognized as simple cruelty and exploitation. These writings, which were studied by each new generation as foundational documents of clan identity, argued that strength was not just an advantage in competition, but a moral imperative that justified any action necessary to maintain and expand one's power over others. The cursed techniques that were developed and refined during this period reflected the clan's growing obsession with domination and control. Beyond the famous 10 shadows, they cultivated abilities that focused on imposing their will upon others through direct manipulation of their bodies and minds. Techniques that required practitioners to view their targets as objects rather than fellow conscious beings worthy of basic consideration and respect. The training methods that were established to pass these techniques to younger generations emphasized the systematic elimination of empathy and compassion as weaknesses that would interfere with effective technique deployment. Children were taught from their earliest years that their value as human beings was determined entirely by their cursed energy reserves and their willingness to use those reserves without hesitation or moral consideration when clan interests demanded decisive action. The political alliances that the Zenin cultivated during this period were based not on shared values or mutual respect, but on calculated assessments of how various relationships could be leveraged to enhance their own position within the broader Jujutsu community. They learned to present themselves as reliable allies while maintaining the flexibility to abandon or betray partners when changing circumstances made such actions advantageous. The economic foundation that supported their lifestyle of luxury and leisure was built upon the exploitation of lesser sorcerer families who were forced to provide services and resources in exchange for protection that was often more theoretical than practical. The Zenin became masters of creating dependencies that ensured steady streams of tribute while maintaining enough distance to avoid responsibility when their clients faced challenges that required genuine assistance. The religious and philosophical justifications that were developed to support these practices drew upon corrupted interpretations of Buddhist and Shinto concepts about hierarchy and destiny, creating a worldview that portrayed their dominance as cosmic necessity rather than historical accident or personal choice. They convinced themselves that they were merely fulfilling roles that had been assigned to them by forces greater than individual will or social convention. The isolation that had initially been a source of strength gradually became a source of weakness as the clan lost touch with the broader currents of change that were transforming Japanese society and the world beyond. Their conviction that they represented the pinnacle of human evolution made them dismissive of developments that might have provided opportunities for growth and adaptation, leaving them increasingly vulnerable to challenges that their traditional approaches could not address effectively. The children who were raised within this system learned from their earliest memories that love was conditional upon performance, that acceptance required the complete subordination of individual desires to collective expectations, and that failure to meet impossible standards would result in rejection so complete that it approached a form of social death. The psychological damage inflicted by these practices was not recognized as damage, but celebrated as necessary hardening that prepared them for the responsibilities that came with superior abilities. The curse that would ultimately destroy the Zenin clan was not imposed from outside but grew from within, nurtured by generations of choices that prioritized power over humanity, tradition over growth, and fear over love. They created a system so perfectly designed to crush the human spirit that it was only a matter of time before someone with sufficient strength and sufficient reason would turn that system's own tools against it with devastating effectiveness. The foundation of corruption that was laid during these formative centuries created the conditions for every tragedy that would follow, every life destroyed, every potential squandered, every opportunity for redemption rejected in favor of maintaining traditions that had long since lost any constructive purpose they might once have served. The ancient bloodline that should have been a source of strength became a chain that bound each new generation to the failures and cruelties of those who had come before. The Zenin clan's internal structure was not merely an organizational chart, but a carefully constructed prison designed to extract maximum utility from every member while ensuring that none possessed sufficient individual power to challenge the system that bound them all in chains of tradition and terror. At its apex sat the clan head, a position that was less leadership role than divine mandate, wielding absolute authority over every aspect of family life with the casual indifference of someone who had never experienced meaningful resistance to their will. The hierarchy that descended from this pinnacle was rigid beyond the comprehension of those raised in societies that valued individual merit or personal choice. Each level defined not by competence or wisdom, but by the perceived strength of one's cursed technique and the circumstances of one's birth. The male heirs who possessed powerful inherited abilities occupied positions of privilege that came with expectations of absolute obedience to those above them and absolute dominance over those below, creating a system where every individual was simultaneously oppressor and victim. The women of the clan existed within a separate but parallel hierarchy that measured their worth entirely through their potential contributions to bloodline continuation and their willingness to serve the needs of male family members, without question or complaint. Their cursed techniques, regardless of their actual power or utility, were evaluated primarily through the lens of how they might enhance the abilities of future children, rather than what they could accomplish through their own efforts and ambitions. the concept of individual autonomy was not merely discouraged within the Zenin system, but treated as a fundamental threat to the natural order that had elevated their family above the masses of ordinary humans and lesser sorcerers who lacked the wisdom to govern themselves effectively. Children were taught from their earliest years that personal desires were symptoms of spiritual weakness that needed to be eliminated through discipline and sacrifice, that true strength came only through perfect alignment with collective goals that transcended selfish individual concerns. The training programs that were designed to shape young Zenin into proper family members were masterpieces of psychological manipulation that broke down personal identity and rebuilt it, according to specifications that served clan interests rather than individual fulfillment. Physical conditioning that pushed bodies to their limits was accompanied by mental conditioning that eliminated empathy, compassion, and moral considerations that might interfere with the ruthless pursuit of power and dominance over others. The living arrangements within the family compound reflected and reinforced these hierarchical relationships through spatial organization that made power dynamics visible and inescapable. The most powerful members occupied the central buildings that commanded views of the entire complex, while those of lesser status were housed in progressively more marginal locations that emphasized their distance from the sources of real authority and decision-making power. The daily routines that governed clan life were structured to provide constant reinforcement of these power relationships through rituals that required formal acknowledgement of superior status and demonstrations of appropriate deference. Meals were elaborate ceremonies where seating arrangements and service protocols communicated messages about relative worth that were more effective than direct verbal instruction in maintaining psychological submission to the established order. The marriage practices that governed relationships between clan members and their interactions with outside families were designed to treat human beings as breeding stock, whose primary value lay in their genetic contributions to future generations rather than their capacity for love, companionship, or mutual support. Women were evaluated like prize livestock, their physical attributes and cursed energy reserves catalogued and compared to determine their suitability for producing children who would enhance the family's supernatural capabilities. The economic system that supported this lifestyle was based on exploitation that extended far beyond the clan boundaries, to include networks of dependent families and organizations that provided resources and services in exchange for protection that was often more theoretical than practical. The Zenin had perfected the art of creating relationships where others bore most of the costs and risks while they reaped the majority of benefits through superior negotiating position backed by overwhelming force. The educational philosophy that shaped how knowledge was transmitted to younger generations emphasized rote memorization of traditional practices and unquestioning acceptance of ancestral wisdom over critical thinking or innovative dane, problem solving that might lead to uncomfortable questions about why things were organized as they were. Students learned techniques and tactics, but were actively discouraged from developing the intellectual tools that might have allowed them to recognize the moral and practical failures of the system they were being prepared to perpetuate. The religious and philosophical frameworks that provided justification for these practices drew upon carefully selected and deliberately misinterpreted elements of various spiritual traditions to create a worldview that portrayed their dominance as cosmic necessity rather than historical accident or conscious choice. They convinced themselves that they were fulfilling divine mandates that made their actions not just acceptable but morally required, regardless of the suffering they caused to others. The judicial system that governed internal disputes and disciplinary actions was designed to reinforce existing power structures, rather than provide genuine justice or resolution for conflicts between family members. Those with superior status could effectively do anything they wished to their inferiors with minimal consequences, while those of lower rank faced severe punishment for even minor violations of the countless rules and expectations that governed their behavior. The communication patterns that were established within the family made honest discussion of problems or concerns virtually impossible, creating an environment where issues festered and grew rather than being addressed through open dialogue and collaborative problem-solving. Direct criticism of senior family members or traditional practices was treated as betrayal that required immediate and decisive punishment, while indirect communication through hints and suggestions was often misunderstood or ignored entirely. The mental health consequences of living within this system were devastating and pervasive, though they were rarely recognized as problems that required attention or treatment. Depression, anxiety, and various forms of psychological trauma were treated as character defects that demonstrated individual weakness rather than natural responses to impossible circumstances and unreasonable demands for perfection in every aspect of performance and behavior. The creative and intellectual potential that existed within the clan was systematically suppressed through educational approaches that valued conformity over innovation and obedience over independent thought. Children who showed signs of artistic talent or intellectual curiosity were redirected toward more practical pursuits that served family interests. Their individual gifts sacrificed to maintain the uniformity that made the system function smoothly without disruption or challenge. The relationships between siblings were poisoned by competition for parental approval and inheritance rights that made genuine affection and mutual support nearly impossible to maintain. Brothers were taught to view each other as rivals for limited resources and opportunities, while sisters learned that their worth was determined by comparison to other potential wives and mothers rather than their individual accomplishments or personal qualities. The isolation from outside influences that was maintained through geographical location and social practices prevented family members from developing relationships that might have provided alternative perspectives on how human beings could treat each other with dignity and respect. The occasional contacts with other families or organizations were carefully controlled to ensure that no one was exposed to ideas or practices that might undermine their commitment to traditional Zenin values and methods. The punishment systems that were used to maintain discipline and compliance were designed to be both physically and psychologically devastating, creating fear so profound that most family members never seriously considered rebellion or escape from their circumstances. The knowledge that transgression would result not just in personal suffering but in consequences for other family members whom they cared about created additional psychological pressure that made resistance seem impossible, as well as pointless. The medical practices that governed healthcare within the clan were influenced more by traditional beliefs about strength and weakness than by modern understanding of human physiology and psychology. Mental illness was treated as moral failure, while physical disabilities were seen as evidence of genetic inferiority that brought shame to the entire family line and required concealment from outsiders who might use such knowledge to their advantage. The leisure activities that were permitted within the clan were strictly limited to pursuits that reinforced approved values and relationships, rather than providing genuine relaxation or personal fulfillment. Even recreational time was structured to serve educational or political purposes, with family members expected to use their free hours for activities that enhanced their usefulness to collective goals, rather than pursuing individual interests or hobbies. The career paths that were available to clan members were determined entirely by family needs and traditional role assignments, rather than individual talents, interests, or aspirations. Personal preferences were considered irrelevant when they conflicted with what the leadership had determined would best serve the clan's long-term strategic objectives and immediate operational requirements. The technological and social changes that were transforming the world beyond their mountain stronghold were viewed with suspicion and hostility rather than curiosity or excitement about new possibilities for human flourishing. Progress was seen as threat to traditional ways of life that had proven their worth through centuries of success, ignoring the costs in human suffering that such success had required from those who lacked the power to resist or escape. The prison of tradition that the Zenin had constructed around themselves was so complete and so thoroughly internalized by each new generation that most family members never even recognized that alternatives might exist, that human beings could organize themselves according to principles of mutual respect and shared benefit rather than domination and exploitation. They lived their entire lives within walls that were invisible but impermeable, barriers constructed not of stone and steel, but of beliefs and expectations that made freedom seem not just impossible but undesirable. The tragedy of the Zenin clan was not that they were evil in any simple or straightforward sense, but that they had created a system so perfectly designed to crush the human spirit that it transformed potentially decent people into instruments of cruelty and oppression. Each generation inherited not just supernatural abilities but psychological damage that they then passed on to their children, creating an endless cycle of trauma and abuse that grew stronger and more destructive with each iteration, until someone with sufficient power and sufficient reason finally broke the cycle through methods that were as devastating as the Peika system they destroyed. The boy who would become Toji Fushiguro entered the world bearing a curse more devastating than any malevolent spirit that had ever plagued the Jujutsu community. He was born into the Zenin clan, completely devoid of cursed energy, a genetic anomaly so profound that it challenged every fundamental assumption about what it meant to be human within their isolated mountain stronghold. The moment the midwives completed their examination and reported their findings to the clan elders, his fate was sealed with the brutal efficiency that characterized every decision made by those who viewed human worth as measurable commodity rather than inherent dignity. The name they gave him was not chosen with love or hope, but selected to reflect the disappointment and shame that his existence represented to a family whose entire identity was built upon supernatural superiority over ordinary humans, and Lissa Sorcias. Toji, meaning to govern or to rule, was bestowed with bitter irony upon a child who would never possess the power necessary to govern anything, not even his own position within the hierarchy that measured every individual's worth through their capacity to manipulate cursed energy with skill and precision. The early years of his childhood were characterized not by the nurturing care that should have been every child's birthright, but by systematic attempts to determine whether his condition might be temporary aberration that could be corrected through proper training and discipline. The clan's most skilled instructors subjected him to regimens designed to awaken dormant abilities that simply did not exist, pushing his small body through exercises that left him exhausted and broken, while producing no evidence of the supernatural gifts that would have transformed him from burden into asset. The psychological impact of these failed attempts at awakening cursed energy capabilities was compounded by the growing realization among family members that his condition was not temporary setback, but permanent disability that marked him as fundamentally different from everyone around him. The initial disappointment that had greeted his birth gradually evolved into something approaching disgust, the understanding that he represented living proof that even the purest bloodlines could produce failures that brought shame upon everything their ancestors had built through centuries of careful cultivation. The treatment he received from other children within the clan reflected and amplified the attitudes that their parents and elders had adopted toward his existence, transforming what should have been peer relationships into constant reminders of his inadequacy and unworthiness. They learned to view him not as sibling or cousin, but as cautionary tale about what happened when bloodlines were contaminated by weakness, using him as target for aggression that helped them feel superior while providing practice for the dominance they would later exercise over those outside the family who lacked their supernatural advantages. The servants and retainers who maintained the clan compound were instructed to treat him with the minimal courtesy necessary to avoid direct confrontation, while making clear through countless small gestures that he occupied a position below even those who were not blood relatives, but who possessed the cursed energy that made them valuable to the family's interests. The isolation that resulted from this treatment was perhaps more damaging than outright cruelty would have been, creating a form of social death that left him alive but completely cut off from meaningful human connection. The educational opportunities that were provided to other young clan members were systematically denied to him under the assumption that someone without cursed energy could never contribute meaningfully to the family's supernatural mission and therefore did not require preparation for adult responsibilities within their community. While his cousins learned history, philosophy, and advanced combat techniques, he was relegated to menial tasks that were designed more to keep him occupied than to develop any skills that might prove useful in future endeavors. The physical training that he pursued independently, driven by desperate need to find some area where he might excel and earn acceptance, revealed capabilities that would have been remarkable in any other context, but which were dismissed as irrelevant by people who could not imagine value existing outside the narrow parameters of cursed energy manipulation. His natural athleticism and combat instincts were products of genetics that had been shaped by generations of warriors, but these gifts were invisible to those who had been conditioned to recognize only supernatural abilities as worthy of attention or respect. The meals that were supposed to provide sustenance and family bonding became daily reminders of his exclusion from the community that shared his blood, but not his condition. Seating arrangements and service protocols that emphasized his marginal status while reinforcing the message that he existed on the periphery of their world, rather than as integral member of their collective identity. The conversations that flowed around him during these gatherings focused on topics that excluded him by design. Discussions of techniques and powers that he could never understand or participate in meaningfully. The sleeping arrangements within the compound placed him in quarters that were physically isolated from the main family areas, ostensibly for practical reasons, but actually to minimize the psychological discomfort that his presence created for those who preferred not to be reminded that their supposedly superior bloodline could produce such obvious failures. The loneliness of these nights was perhaps the most devastating aspect of his childhood. Lying awake in darkness while hearing the sounds of family life continuing without him in spaces that he was not welcome to enter. The medical attention that he received when injuries occurred during his unsupervised training sessions was minimal and grudging, provided more out of legal obligation than genuine concern for his welfare. The clan's physicians had been trained to view him as curiosity rather than patient, more interested in studying his unusual physiology than in ensuring his recovery and continued health. The pain that he endured during these examinations was both physical and emotional, constant reminder that even his suffering was seen primarily as opportunity for research rather than human experience deserving of compassion. The religious and philosophical instruction that formed such crucial components of other children's education was withheld from him based on the assumption that someone without cursed energy could never truly understand the spiritual principles that governed their world. This educational neglect left him without the intellectual frameworks that might have helped him process his experiences and develop healthy responses to the trauma and rejection that defined his daily existence within the clan structure. The few moments of kindness that he experienced during these formative years came not from family members, but from outsiders who occasionally visited the compound and who had not yet been instructed in the proper way to treat him. These brief encounters with people who saw him as child rather than disappointment provided glimpses of what normal human interaction might feel like, making his return to the clan's treatment even more painful by contrast with possibilities that remained forever out of reach. The gradual realization that his condition was not temporary phase, but permanent aspect of his identity, required psychological adjustments that no child should have been forced to make without guidance and support from caring adults. The acceptance that he would never possess the abilities that defined worth within his community was accompanied by growing anger that had nowhere to go except inward, creating patterns of self-hatred and destructive behavior that would shape his adult personality and choices. The escape fantasies that occupied his imagination during the darkest periods of his childhood were not dreams of adventure or heroism, but simple visions of existing somewhere where his worth was not determined by supernatural abilities he could never possess. These daydreams provided temporary refuge from reality, but also highlighted the trap that his circumstances represented. The understanding that leaving the clan would mean abandoning the only world he had ever known while remaining guaranteed continued suffering and rejection. The physical development that occurred as he matured revealed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations despite his lack of cursed energy, strength and speed that approached supernatural levels through purely biological means. This discovery provided the first hope he had experienced that he might possess value that others could recognize, even if that recognition came through violence rather than the acceptance and love that he had always craved but never received. The weapons training that he pursued in secret, using equipment stolen from the clan's armories, became both practical preparation for potential escape and psychological outlet for frustrations that had no other acceptable expression within the rigid social structure that governed his existence. Each technique mastered represented small victory over the limitations that had been imposed upon him, proof that determination could overcome at least some of the disadvantages created by circumstances beyond his control. The first successful combat encounter that demonstrated his lethal potential occurred when he defended himself against older clan members who had chosen him as target for aggression that was supposedly intended as training, but which was actually sanctioned bullying, designed to reinforce power, dynamics, and social hierarchies. The shock and fear that his victory produced among witnesses was intoxicating in ways that he had never experienced. The first time in his life that others had looked at him with something other than contempt or pity. The reputation that began to develop around his combat abilities created complicated changes in how other clan members interacted with him, fear replacing disgust, but not evolving into anything approaching respect or acceptance. He had proven that he could be dangerous, but this only made him more threatening to those who had spent years treating him as harmless nuisance rather than person deserving of basic human dignity. The isolation that had characterized his childhood persisted into adolescence, but now it was maintained through wariness rather than dismissal. The decision to leave the clan was not dramatic rebellion, but gradual recognition that he had no future within a community that would never accept him regardless of what he accomplished or how he tried to prove his worth through methods that they could understand and appreciate. The departure, when it finally occurred, was accomplished through careful planning rather than impulsive escape, understanding that his survival would depend on preparation and resources that he had accumulated through years of patient effort. The world beyond the clan compound was simultaneously liberating and terrifying for someone who had spent his entire life within the confines of a single community however dysfunctional and abusive that community had been. The freedom to make his own choices was accompanied by complete lack of preparation for independent existence in society that operated according to rules and expectations that were completely foreign to everything he had learned about human interaction and social organization. The transformation from rejected clan member to professional assassin was not sudden metamorphosis, but gradual evolution, driven by the recognition that his unique combination of supernatural physical abilities and complete invisibility to cursed energy detection made him perfectly suited for eliminating sorcerers who had never imagined that they could be threatened by someone who existed outside their understanding of how power functioned in their world. The psychological damage that had been inflicted during his childhood manifested in adult relationships characterized by emotional detachment and inability to form genuine connections with others, defense mechanisms that had been necessary for survival within the clan, but which prevented him from experiencing the love and acceptance that might have healed some of the wounds created by years of systematic rejection and dehumanization. The brief period of happiness that he experienced when he met and married Megumi's mother represented the only time in his adult life when he glimpsed the possibility that human connection might be possible for someone with his history and psychological makeup. Her acceptance of him without conditions or expectations provided healing that he had never imagined possible, transforming him temporarily from weapon into something approaching normal human being, capable of caring for others more than himself. The return to his destructive patterns following her death was not conscious choice but inevitable consequence of losing the only person who had ever seen him as worthy of love rather than fear, rage, or exploitation. The grief that consumed him was mixed with terror at the prospect of returning to the isolation that had defined most of his existence, creating desperate need to reject emotional vulnerability before it could be used against him again by people who understood how to weaponize hope and affection. The final confrontation with his past that occurred during his battle with Gojo Satoru was simultaneously attempt to prove his worth through violence and unconscious desire for ending that would release him from the psychological prison that his childhood experiences had created within his mind. The death that concluded this encounter was both defeat and victory, failure to achieve the validation he had sought, but success in finally escaping the trap that his birth into the Zenin clan had created for someone whose only crime was existing outside the narrow parameters of what they considered acceptable human variation. The legacy that he left behind in the form of his son represented both hope and potential tragedy. The possibility that the next generation might escape the cycles of abuse and rejection that had shaped his own development, but also the danger that similar patterns might repeat themselves if Megumi were ever forced to face the same circumstances that had broken his father's spirit and turned him from potential protector into instrument of destruction and death. The twins, who would become known as Maki and Mai Zenin, entered the world on a winter morning when snow fell like tears from a grey sky, their birth representing both miraculous gift and devastating curse to a family that had spent generations perfecting the art of transforming human potential into tools of domination and control. The midwives who attended their delivery understood immediately that something unprecedented had occurred, though the full implications of what they witnessed would not become clear until years of careful observation revealed the true nature of the supernatural anomaly that had manifested in these two small bodies. The cursed energy that should have been distributed normally between two separate individuals had instead been split unevenly, leaving Mai with barely enough supernatural power to qualify as a sorcerer, while Maki possessed so little that she might as well have been born without any cursed energy at all. This division created a symbiotic relationship that neither child understood, but which would define every aspect of their development and their relationship with each other and the clan that viewed them as expensive disappointments rather than beloved daughters. The initial reaction of the clan elders to this unusual situation was careful observation designed to determine whether the twins represented some new form of inherited technique that might eventually prove valuable, or whether they were simply genetic failures whose existence brought shame to a bloodline that prided itself on producing consistently powerful heirs. The tests and examinations that were conducted during their early years were invasive and frightening. Medical procedures disguised as routine care but actually designed to probe the mysteries of their unusual condition. The childhood that unfolded within the clan compound was characterized by constant comparison and evaluation that poisoned what should have been natural sisterly affection and transformed it into complex mixture of love and resentment that neither girl fully understood. Mai's slightly superior cursed energy reserves made her the favored twin in the eyes of adults who measured human worth through supernatural capability, while Maki's near-complete lack of such abilities marked her for the kind of systematic rejection and dehumanization that the clan had perfected through generations of practice. The different treatment that the twins received from family members created psychological pressures that forced them to develop survival strategies that put them in opposition to each other, rather than allowing them to support each other against the hostile environment that surrounded them. Mai learned that compliance and submission to clan expectations could earn her minimal acceptance and protection, while Maki discovered that resistance and defiance only brought more severe punishment and isolation from the few sources of comfort available within their restricted world. The training regimens that were designed for each twin reflected the clan's assessment of their respective potential and the roles they might eventually play within the family structure. Mai's education focused on developing her limited curse technique, while emphasizing the domestic skills and submissive attitudes that would make her valuable as wife and mother to whatever male relative or allied family member was chosen for her. Maki's training was minimal and grudging, designed more to keep her occupied than to develop capabilities that no one believed she possessed. The sleeping arrangements that placed them in the same room were supposed to provide comfort and companionship, but they actually created additional psychological pressure as each girl was forced to witness the other's suffering and to confront the impossible choices that their circumstances demanded. Mai's nightmares about the violence and cruelty that surrounded them were matched by Maki's dreams of escape and revenge, creating an atmosphere of shared trauma that was complicated by the different ways they had learned to process and respond to their experiences. The meals that were supposed to provide nourishment and family bonding became daily reminders of their marginal status within the clan hierarchy, seating arrangements and service protocols that emphasized their position as burdens rather than valued members of the family community. The conversations that occurred during these gatherings excluded them from discussions of important family business, while including enough detail to make them understand their own powerlessness and insignificance within the larger schemes that governed clan operations. The education that was provided to them was deliberately limited and gender-specific, designed to prepare Mai for her eventual role as wife and breeding partner, while ensuring that Maki remained ignorant of the knowledge and skills that might have allowed her to challenge or escape the system that oppressed them both. The books and instructors that were made available to them emphasized traditional values and female submission, while carefully avoiding any information that might have inspired them to question the assumptions that governed their pride. Treatment. The medical care that they received was adequate but impersonal, provided by physicians who viewed them as interesting cases rather than children deserving of compassion and healing. The examinations and treatments that were administered often seemed designed more to gather data about their unusual condition than to ensure their health and well-being, creating associations between healthcare and violation that would persist into their adult lives and relationships. The religious instruction that formed part of their education was carefully edited to emphasize themes of duty, sacrifice, and acceptance of divine will, while omitting teachings about human dignity, individual worth, and the obligation to resist injustice and oppression. They learned to pray for strength to endure their circumstances rather than courage to change them. Spiritual frameworks that reinforced their psychological captivity rather than providing tools for liberation and growth. The few moments of genuine happiness that they experienced during their childhood came through secret games and private conversations that allowed them to express feelings and thoughts that were forbidden in the presence of adult family members. These stolen moments of normalcy were precious but also dangerous, creating bonds that the clan could exploit to control both girls through threats to the welfare of the sister each cared about more than herself. The physical development that occurred as they matured revealed capabilities that challenged some of the assumptions that had governed their treatment during early childhood. Maki's lack of cursed energy was accompanied by increasing physical strength and combat instincts that approached supernatural levels, while Mai's limited cursed technique proved more versatile and powerful than initial assessments had suggested. These discoveries created new pressures and expectations that complicated their relationship with each other and with the clan leadership. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked their transition from childhood to adolescence were conducted with minimal fanfare and maximum emphasis on their obligations as female clan members to serve the interests of male relatives and accept whatever marriages or arrangements were made for them. The rituals that should have celebrated their maturation instead reinforced messages about their subordinate status and limited options for future development and self-determination. The first serious conflict between the twins occurred when Maki began to express open defiance toward clan expectations, and Mai tried to convince her sister to accept their circumstances for the sake of survival and minimal peace. This disagreement reflected their different responses to trauma and oppression. Maki's growing anger and determination to fight versus Mai's strategic submission and hope that compliance might eventually earn them both some measure of safety and acceptance. The punishment that followed Maki's first serious act of rebellion was designed to send messages to both sisters about the consequences of resistance, while testing whether Mai could be trusted to help control her more troublesome twin. The psychological pressure created by this situation forced both girls to make choices that damaged their relationship while serving the clan's interests in maintaining control over two potential sources of disruption to established hierarchies. The weapons training that Maki pursued in secret was both practical preparation for eventual escape and psychological outlet for frustrations and rage that had no other acceptable expression within the rigid social structure that governed their existence. Each technique mastered represented small victory over the limitations that had been imposed upon her, while also creating capabilities that could eventually be used to protect both herself and her sister from the violence that surrounded them. The cursed technique development that Mai achieved through dedicated practice was motivated partly by desire to prove her worth to clan members who viewed her as barely acceptable, and partly by hope that increased power might provide protection for both twins against the dangers that threatened them. Her ability to create objects through cursed energy manipulation was versatile and potentially powerful, but it required resources and concentration that made it unsuitable for prolonged combat or escape scenarios. The social dynamics within the clan compound became increasingly complex as other family members began to recognize that both twins possessed capabilities that exceeded initial assessments, creating new forms of jealousy and resentment that added layers of danger to their already precarious situation. The adults who had dismissed them as failures now viewed them as potential threats that required careful monitoring and possibly preemptive action to prevent future challenges to established authority. The romantic interests that began to develop during their adolescence were immediately suppressed and redirected by clan leadership, determined to maintain control over their reproductive potential and ensure that any marriages served strategic family interests rather than personal happiness or emotional fulfillment. The young men who showed interest in either twin were warned away through methods that ranged from social pressure to direct threats of violence. The isolation from outside influences that characterized their upbringing became more pronounced as they approached adulthood. The clan leadership, understanding that exposure to different values and social arrangements might provide them with dangerous ideas about alternatives to the life that had been planned for them. The few contacts with the external world that were permitted were carefully supervised to ensure that no subversive influences could take root in minds that were already showing signs of independent thinking. The decision point that would ultimately determine their different paths came when Maki announced her intention to leave the clan and attend Tokyo Jujutsu High, a choice that Mai viewed as betrayal and abandonment, rather than courageous pursuit of freedom and self-determination. This disagreement revealed the fundamental difference in how they had processed their shared trauma, Maki choosing confrontation and escape, while Mai opted for accommodation and survival within the system that had shaped them both. The pressure that was brought to bear on Mai to discourage her sister's rebellion was both subtle and overwhelming. Family members making clear that her cooperation in preventing Maki's departure would be rewarded, while her failure to control her twin would result in consequences for both of them. This manipulation transformed Mai's natural desire to protect her sister into a weapon that the clan could use to maintain control over both girls through emotional blackmail. The internal conflict that this situation created within Mai was devastating and lasting, forcing her to choose between supporting her sister's pursuit of freedom and protecting both of them from retaliation that she believed would be swift and merciless. The decision she made to actively oppose Maki's plans was motivated by love rather than hatred, but it created resentment and misunderstanding that would poison their relationship for years to come. The departure that Maki accomplished, despite her sister's opposition, was both liberation and abandonment. Freedom purchased at the cost of leaving behind the person she cared about most in circumstances that she knew were dangerous and oppressive. The guilt that accompanied her escape was matched by determination to succeed in the outside world and eventually return strong enough to rescue Mai from the prison they had both inhabited since birth. The aftermath of Maki's departure left Mai alone with clan members who viewed her remaining presence as both opportunity and liability. Someone who could be molded into the perfect example of female submission, while also representing constant reminder of the sister who had escaped their control. The psychological pressure of this situation was compounded by her own conflicted feelings about whether she had made the right choice in opposing Maki's plans and remaining within the clan structure. The years that followed were characterized by Mai's gradual transformation into exactly what the clan wanted her to become, a process that required the systematic suppression of every aspect of her personality and potential that might have allowed her to follow her sister's example and pursue independent existence outside the confines of traditional expectations. The compliance that she achieved was purchased at enormous psychological cost, creating internal conflicts that manifested in depression, anxiety, and self-destructive behaviors that the clan interpreted as evidence of her weak character rather than symptoms of systematic abuse. The reunion with Maki during the Goodwill event created opportunities for communication that revealed how thoroughly their different choices had changed them both. Maki's growing strength and confidence contrasting with Mai's increasing fragility and dependence on clan approval for basic self-worth. The conversation they shared was loaded with years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding that neither was prepared to address directly or constructively. The final sacrifice that Mai made to provide Maki with the power necessary to destroy the system that had oppressed them both was simultaneously act of love and admission of defeat, recognition that her strategy of survival through compliance had failed to protect either of them, while Maki's approach of resistance and escape offered the only hope for justice and freedom. The death that accompanied this gift was both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one sister's suffering and the commencement of the other's transformation into force, capable of bringing down everything that had caused their pain. The legacy that their relationship left behind was a complex mixture of tragedy and triumph, demonstration of how love could survive even the most determined efforts to poison it, while also showing the devastating costs that systematic oppression imposed on its victims. The twins who had been born as single souls split between two bodies had finally achieved unity through sacrifice that allowed one to become what both had always possessed the potential to become, if circumstances had permitted their gifts to flourish, rather than forcing them to choose between survival and growth, compliance and freedom, love and liberation. The child who would become Naoya Zenin entered the world amid celebrations that had been absent from the clan compound for generations, his birth representing not merely the arrival of another heir, but the manifestation of everything. The family had spent centuries cultivating through careful breeding and relentless pursuit of genetic superiority. The cursed energy that radiated from his infant form was so powerful and refined that even the most jaded clan elders found themselves genuinely excited about the potential that lay dormant within this small body, understanding that they were witnessing the emergence of someone who might finally fulfill their ancient dreams of absolute dominance. The name they bestowed upon him carried expectations that would have crushed ordinary children, but which seemed perfectly appropriate for someone whose supernatural gifts promised to surpass even the most optimistic projections about what their bloodline might eventually produce. Naoya, meaning honest or straightforward, was chosen to reflect their hope that he would embody their values without the complications of doubt or moral hesitation that had weakened previous generations who allowed sentiment to interfere with the ruthless pursuit of power and control over others. The nursery that was prepared for his infancy was decorated with artifacts and symbols that reinforced messages about strength, dominance, and the natural hierarchy that placed the Zenin above all other forms of human existence. The scrolls that adorned the walls depicted legendary clan members engaged in acts of supernatural violence, while the toys that were provided for his entertainment were miniature weapons and training devices designed to familiarize him with the tools he would eventually use to impose his will upon those too weak to resist his authority. The care that was lavished upon him during his early years was unprecedented in its attention to detail and resource allocation, the entire clan mobilizing to ensure that every aspect of his development proceeded according to carefully designed plans that would maximize his potential while eliminating any influences that might compromise his commitment to traditional values and methods. The servants who attended him were selected for their complete loyalty to clan interests and their willingness to reinforce approved attitudes through every interaction and service they provided. The feeding schedules and dietary requirements that governed his nutrition were calculated to enhance his cursed energy development while ensuring optimal physical growth that would support the supernatural abilities that were already manifesting at levels that exceeded historical precedents. The foods that were provided came from sources that had been carefully vetted to eliminate any contamination from inferior bloodlines or external influences that might dilute the purity of what he consumed and incorporated into his developing body. The educational program that began before he could speak was designed to shape his understanding of the world according to principles that had been refined through centuries of clan experience, with raising heirs who would serve family interests rather than pursuing individual goals that might conflict with collective needs and strategic objectives. The lullabies that were sung to him contained lessons about strength and weakness, while the stories that were told during quiet moments reinforced themes of dominance and submission that would form the foundation of his adult worldview. The physical training that commenced as soon as he could walk was intensive beyond anything that had been attempted with previous clan heirs. His supernatural constitution, allowing him to endure regimens that would have hospitalized ordinary children, while building the strength and endurance that would support increasingly advanced technique development. The exercises that were designed for him pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or reasonable, but his remarkable recovery abilities and apparent enthusiasm for challenge made such extremes seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The social interactions that were permitted during his childhood were carefully controlled to ensure that he was exposed only to influences that would reinforce approved attitudes and behaviors, while protecting him from ideas or relationships that might undermine his developing sense of superiority and entitlement. The other children who were allowed to play with him were selected for their ability to provide appropriate deference and stimulation, without offering serious competition that might damage his confidence or create doubts about his exceptional nature. The religious and philosophical instruction that formed crucial components of his education emphasized interpretations of traditional teachings that justified and celebrated the use of power to impose order upon those who lacked the wisdom or strength to govern themselves effectively. He learned that compassion was weakness that interfered with necessary discipline, that mercy was indulgence that enabled destructive behaviors, and that equality was dangerous fiction that prevented natural hierarchies from functioning properly. The cultural education that accompanied his technical training included extensive study of clan history and achievements that presented every act of violence and domination as heroic example worthy of emulation and celebration. The ancestors whose portraits lined the halls of their compound were transformed through storytelling into mythological figures whose greatness was measured by their willingness to eliminate threats and obstacles without regard for the basis, suffering such actions caused to those who stood in their way. The language instruction that he received went beyond basic communication skills to include the subtle distinctions of rank and status that were embedded in Japanese honorific systems, ensuring that he would never accidentally treat social inferiors with inappropriate respect or fail to demand proper deference from those whose circumstances required submission to his authority. Every conversation became practice session for maintaining proper hierarchical relationships that reinforced his superior position. The artistic appreciation that was considered essential to his development as cultured heir focused exclusively on works that celebrated themes of power, conquest, and the natural dominance of superior individuals over lesser masses who existed primarily to serve the needs and desires of their betters. Poetry, painting, and music were evaluated according to how effectively they reinforced approved values, rather than their intrinsic beauty or emotional impact on audiences who might respond to different aesthetic criteria. The coming-of-age ceremony that marked his transition from childhood to adolescence was conducted with unprecedented pageantry and expense that demonstrated the clan's investment in his future, while making clear to everyone present that exceptional resources and attention had been devoted to ensuring his proper development. The rituals that were performed during this celebration emphasized his obligations to continue and expand the family's dominance while enjoying privileges that came with his superior abilities and bloodline. The romantic education that was provided during his adolescence focused entirely on the strategic and practical aspects of relationships, while systematically eliminating any consideration of emotional connection, mutual respect, or genuine affection between partners who might choose each other based on compatibility rather than advantage. He learned to evaluate potential wives according to their genetic contributions to future children and their willingness to serve his needs, without making demands that might interfere with his other responsibilities and interests. The advanced combat training that occupied increasing amounts of his time as he matured revealed capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections that had been made about his potential during infancy and childhood. His inherited technique, which allowed him to manipulate his own speed and acceleration to levels that approached teleportation, was refined through practice sessions that pushed both his abilities and his opponents to their absolute limits, while providing practical experience with the application of overwhelming power against resistance. The political education that prepared him for eventual leadership roles within the clan and broader Jujutsu society emphasized the importance of maintaining traditional hierarchies and power structures that had served their interests for centuries, while adapting to changing circumstances through methods that preserved essential relationships rather than allowing dangerous innovations to undermine established authorities and privileges. He learned to view reform movements and social changes as threats that required decisive action rather than opportunities for improvement or growth. The psychological conditioning that accompanied all aspects of his development was designed to eliminate empathy, compassion, and moral considerations that might interfere with his willingness to use whatever methods were necessary to achieve objectives that served clan interests. The capacity for genuine human connection was systematically suppressed through training exercises that rewarded cruelty and punished kindness, creating personality structures that viewed other people as tools or obstacles rather than fellow conscious beings deserving of basic consideration and respect. The first serious combat encounter that tested his abilities against genuinely dangerous opponents revealed both the effectiveness of his training and the psychological damage that had been inflicted during his development into the perfect clonaire. His victory was achieved through methods that demonstrated technical mastery, combined with complete disregard for the suffering he inflicted. Satisfaction derived not from accomplishment, but from the domination and humiliation of someone who had dared to challenge his superiority. The reaction of clan elders to this demonstration of his capabilities was celebratory in ways that reinforced his understanding that violence and domination were not just acceptable but praiseworthy when employed by someone of his status and abilities. The praise that he received for his ruthless efficiency in eliminating threats created psychological associations between cruelty and approval that would shape his approach to every subsequent relationship and challenge throughout his adult life. The isolation from normal human relationships that had characterized his upbringing became even more pronounced as he approached adulthood, his growing reputation for casual cruelty making even clan members wary of interactions that might trigger his temper or provide him with opportunities to demonstrate his power through methods that they might find personally uncomfortable. The loneliness that resulted from this isolation was not recognized as a problem, but celebrated as evidence of his transcendence above ordinary human needs and limitations. The sexual education that was provided to him treated physical intimacy as another form of domination and conquest, rather than mutual pleasure and emotional connection between partners who cared about each other's welfare and satisfaction. He learned techniques and approaches that emphasized his control and gratification, while ensuring that his partners understood their subordinate roles and obligations to serve his desires without expecting reciprocation or consideration for their own needs and preferences. The missions that were assigned to him during his final years of preparation for adult responsibilities were designed to provide practical experience with the kinds of challenges he would face as clan leader, while testing his willingness to implement traditional methods without hesitation or moral consideration. His performance during these assignments exceeded expectations while revealing the complete absence of human compassion that made him perfectly suited for roles that required decisive action without regard for collateral damage or unintended consequences. The philosophical discussions that he engaged in with clan elders and advisors during this period revealed sophisticated understanding of the intellectual frameworks that justified their approach to power and authority, combined with complete inability to consider alternative perspectives that might challenge or modify traditional approaches. His arguments were logically consistent within the narrow parameters of clan doctrine, while demonstrating profound disconnection from broader human values and moral considerations. The encounter with Maki and Mai that would later define his relationship with the broader Jujutsu world was characterized by casual assessment of their potential value as wives and breeding partners, rather than recognition of their individual capabilities or humanity. His comments about their appearance and suitability for supporting male relatives revealed the complete objectification of women that had been central to his education, while demonstrating his inability to see them as anything other than resources to be evaluated and potentially exploited. The prospect of inheriting clan leadership filled him with excitement that was focused entirely on the opportunities for expanded power and control, rather than any consideration of responsibilities to improve conditions for family members or contribute to broader social welfare. His vision of the future was characterized by systematic elimination of challenges to clan authority combined with expansion of their influence through methods that prioritize dominance over cooperation or mutual benefit. The tragedy of Naoya Zenin was not that he chose evil over good in moments of moral crisis, but that his development had been so thoroughly controlled and directed that he never experienced genuine choice or encountered alternatives that might have allowed him to become something other than the perfect expression of his family's most toxic values and destructive traditions. He was simultaneously perpetrator and victim, monster and product of monstrous system that had transformed human potential into instrument of oppression and suffering that would ultimately destroy everything it touched, including those who believed themselves its greatest beneficiaries. The man who sat at the apex of Zenin clan hierarchy during the twilight years of their dominance was not born to evil, but molded by it through decades of systematic indoctrination that transformed whatever capacity for human decency he might once have possessed into instruments of control and oppression that served the family's interests while destroying everything genuinely valuable about the traditions they claimed to preserve. Naobito Zenin had inherited his position through the same combination of supernatural ability and ruthless political maneuvering that had elevated every previous clan head. But his tenure would be remembered not for innovation or wisdom, but for the perfect crystallization of everything toxic and destructive about the system he had spent his entire life learning to perpetuate. The childhood that had shaped his understanding of power and responsibility bore all the hallmarks of aristocratic privilege, corrupted by isolation from the consequences of the decisions that maintained their elevated position within Jujutsu society, surrounded by servants who catered to his every whim and family members who treated his slightest preference as divine commandment. He learned to view other human beings as resources that existed primarily to facilitate his comfort and advancement, rather than as individuals deserving of basic consideration and respect. The education that had prepared him for leadership roles within the clan emphasized technical mastery of inherited curse techniques while systematically eliminating any exposure to philosophical frameworks that might have encouraged empathy, moral reasoning, or consideration of alternatives to traditional approaches that had been refined through generations of successful domination over those too weak to resist their authority. The books that were provided for his study focused exclusively on strategy, tactics, and the historical precedents that justified whatever actions served clan interests. The political training that had occupied much of his adolescence and early adulthood involved careful observation of how previous clan leaders had maintained their position through combination of reward and punishment that kept potential rivals off balance while ensuring absolute loyalty from subordinates who understood that their welfare depended entirely upon continued demonstration of usefulness and obedience. He learned to identify and eliminate threats before they could fully manifest while cultivating dependencies that made resistance seem both impossible and inadvisable. The marriage that had been arranged to consolidate his claim to leadership was conducted according to protocols that treated his wife as valuable breeding stock rather than partner in mutual enterprise, her individual desires and capabilities subordinated to the larger project of producing heirs, whose genetic inheritance would ensure continued clan dominance for future generations. The relationship that developed was characterized by formal courtesy that masked complete emotional disconnection and strategic calculation that reduced every interaction to assessment of advantage and opportunity. The children that resulted from this union were viewed primarily through the lens of their potential contributions to family power and prestige. Their individual personalities and preferences, either ignored or actively suppressed when they conflicted with predetermined roles that had been assigned based on their cursed energy reserves and technique manifestations. The love that should have characterized parental relationships was replaced by conditional approval that was withdrawn whenever their behavior or development failed to meet expectations that had been established without consideration for their actual capabilities or interests. The assumption of clan leadership that marked his transition from heir to authority was accomplished through methods that demonstrated both his mastery of traditional political techniques and his complete internalization of values that justified any action in service of maintaining and expanding family influence within Jujutsu society. The rivals who might have challenged his succession were eliminated or marginalized through combination of bribery, intimidation, and strategic application of violence that was carefully calculated to achieve desired results without creating unnecessary complications or drawing unwanted attention from external authorities. The administrative policies that he implemented during his tenure as clan head were designed to maximize efficiency in extracting resources and obedience from family members, while minimizing the costs associated with providing them with pace. Anything beyond basic necessities required for continued productivity. The compound that housed the extended family was transformed into something approaching industrial facility where human beings were processed according to standardized procedures that reduced individual variation to manageable parameters. The disciplinary systems that governed internal disputes and violations of clan regulations were refined to achieve perfect balance between deterrence and resource conservation. punishments calibrated to discourage future infractions, while avoiding permanent damage to valuable family assets. The courts that adjudicated these matters operated according to principles that prioritized maintaining hierarchical relationships over achieving justice or resolving underlying conflicts that might indicate systemic problems requiring structural changes. The economic strategies that sustained their lifestyle of luxury and political influence were based on exploitation relationships that extracted maximum value from dependent families and organizations, while providing minimal reciprocal benefits that could be withdrawn at any time without legal or social consequences. The networks of obligation and debt that he cultivated extended throughout Jujutsu society, creating dependencies that could be leveraged to achieve objectives that might otherwise have required more expensive or risky methods. The educational philosophies that governed how younger clan members were trained and developed emphasized perfect replication of traditional approaches while systematically eliminating critical thinking or innovative problem solving that might lead to uncomfortable questions about the moral foundations of their system. The instructors who were employed to provide this education were selected for their complete loyalty to established methods rather than their competence or ability to inspire genuine learning and growth. The religious observances that provided spiritual justification for clan practices were carefully edited to emphasize themes of divine hierarchy and predestination, while omitting teachings about human dignity, universal compassion, or moral obligations that transcended narrow self-interest. The ceremonies that were conducted to mark important occasions reinforced messages about natural superiority and the cosmic necessity of maintaining traditional power relationships. The social events that provided opportunities for networking with other powerful families were orchestrated to demonstrate clan wealth and influence, while gathering intelligence about potential threats and opportunities that might affect their strategic position within the broader Jujutsu community. The entertainments that were provided during these gatherings were designed to impress guests, while subtly reinforcing messages about the consequences of challenging Zenin authority or interests. The military preparations that occupied increasing amounts of attention during his later years reflected growing awareness that the world beyond their mountain stronghold was changing in ways that might eventually threaten the isolation and autonomy that had protected them from external interference with their internal affairs. The weapons and techniques that were developed during this period were designed to address threats that traditional approaches might not handle effectively, while maintaining the essential characteristics that made their methods superior to alternatives employed by lesser families. The intelligence networks that he cultivated throughout Jujutsu society provided detailed information about the activities and intentions of potential rivals, while creating opportunities to manipulate events in ways that served clan interests, without revealing the extent of their involvement in outcomes that might appear to result from natural developments or coincidental circumstances. The agents who served these networks were bound by obligations that made betrayal both difficult and catastrophically expensive. The marriage arrangements that he negotiated for his children and other family members were designed to strengthen political alliances, while ensuring genetic compatibility that would produce grandchildren whose supernatural abilities exceeded those of previous generations. The negotiations that preceded these unions were conducted with the same attention to detail that characterized major business transactions. Human happiness and compatibility treated as irrelevant considerations that might interfere with optimal strategic outcomes. The treatment of female family members under his leadership reflected and amplified traditional attitudes that viewed women primarily as resources for producing powerful heirs, while providing domestic services that freed male relatives to focus on more important responsibilities related to maintaining and expanding clan influence. The restrictions that were placed on their education, movement, and social interactions were justified through appeals to protective instincts and traditional values that masked systematic oppression designed to prevent them from developing capabilities or relationships that might challenge established power structures. The response to challenges and rebellions that emerged during his tenure was swift and overwhelming, designed to discourage future resistance while demonstrating the futility of opposing clan authority through methods that were both traditional and innovative. The examples that were made of those who dared to question established procedures or expectations were carefully calculated to achieve maximum deterrent effect, while avoiding actions that might draw unwanted attention from external authorities or create sympathy for the victims among other family members. The medical care that was provided to clan members reflected cost-benefit analyses that prioritized maintaining productive capacity while minimizing expenses associated with treating conditions or injuries that did not directly affect their ability to serve family interests. The physicians who were employed to provide these services understood that their primary obligation was to the clan leadership rather than to individual patients, whose welfare was secondary to broader organizational objectives. The legacy planning that occupied much of his attention during his final years was focused on ensuring smooth transition of authority to successors who had been thoroughly prepared to continue traditional approaches while adapting to changing circumstances through methods that preserved essential power relationships. The documents that were prepared to govern this transition reflected decades of experience with maintaining control over complex organizations while managing the inevitable conflicts that arose when individual ambitions conflicted with collective needs. The philosophical framework that justified his approach to leadership was based on sophisticated understanding of how power functioned within hierarchical organizations, combined with complete inability to consider alternative models that might achieve similar results through methods that imposed fewer costs on subordinates or provided greater opportunities for individual fulfillment and growth. His arguments were internally consistent within the narrow parameters of clan doctrine, while demonstrating profound disconnection from broader human values and moral considerations. The relationships that he maintained with other clan leaders and Jujutsu society figures were characterized by careful calculation of mutual advantage, combined with constant vigilance for signs of weakness or opportunity that might be exploited to improve the Zenin position relative to potential competitors. The friendships that appeared to exist were actually strategic alliances that could be modified or terminated whenever circumstances required different approaches to achieving predetermined objectives. The training programs that he personally supervised for the most promising young clan members were designed to identify and develop individuals who possessed both exceptional supernatural abilities and the psychological characteristics necessary for implementing traditional methods without hesitation or moral consideration. The graduates of these programs became the instruments through which his vision of continued clan dominance would be implemented in future generations. The final years of his leadership were characterized by growing awareness that forces beyond his control were creating conditions that might eventually threaten the stability and continuity of everything he had spent his life building and protecting. The changes that were occurring within Jujutsu society and the world beyond suggested that traditional approaches might prove inadequate for addressing challenges that required adaptation and innovation rather than simple application of overwhelming force. The death that concluded his tenure as clan head was neither heroic sacrifice nor tragic accident, but natural consequence of a life spent in service to values and systems that consumed their servants as readily as their victims. leaving behind legacy of institutional cruelty that would survive long after the individuals who had created and maintained it had returned to dust. The funeral that marked his passing was conducted with elaborate ceremony that celebrated his achievements, while carefully avoiding acknowledgement of the human costs that such achievements had required from those who lacked the power to resist or escape the system he had perfected. The boy who would carry the weight of the 10 Shadows technique was born not into the loving embrace of family, but into the crossfire of competing claims and ancient grudges that had festered within the Zenin clan for generations. His very existence representing both vindication of their breeding practices and ultimate irony of their systematic cruelty toward those they deemed inferior. Megumi Fushiguro entered the world bearing the most coveted inheritance in clan history, while being denied access to the community that should have nurtured and guided his development, a paradox that would define every aspect of his relationship with power, identity, and the legacy that connected him to ancestors who had never shown him anything resembling love or acceptance. The cursed technique that manifested in his small hands during earliest childhood was not merely supernatural ability, but cosmic joke played upon a family that had spent centuries pursuing the very power that now resided within someone they had rejected and abandoned through their own short-sighted cruelty and obsession with genetic purity over human decency. The shadows that danced at his command contained potential that exceeded even the most optimistic projections about what the 10 shadows could accomplish when wielded by someone with sufficient skill and determination. But this potential would develop outside the traditional frameworks that had guided previous inheritors. The abandonment that had left him in the care of people who had no understanding of his supernatural heritage was both devastating loss and miraculous salvation, protecting him from the systematic indoctrination that had transformed previous 10 Shadows users into instruments of clan ambition while leaving him vulnerable to dangers that proper training might have helped him avoid. The ordinary family that raised him provided love and stability that were completely foreign to Zenin traditions, creating psychological foundations that would prove both strength and complication when he eventually encountered the world of Jujutsu sorcery. The sister who shared his early years represented everything that the Zenin clan claimed to value but consistently failed to protect: innocence and potential that existed outside their narrow definitions of worth and usefulness. Sumiki's presence in his life provided motivation that transcended personal advancement or technical mastery, understanding that his developing abilities carried obligations to protect those who could not protect themselves, rather than dominating those too weak to resist his growing power. The poverty that characterized their childhood was both practical hardship and spiritual education that taught him lessons about resilience, mutual dependence, and the value of human connection that no amount of clan wealth or privilege could have provided. The struggles they faced together created bonds that were based on genuine affection and shared experience rather than strategic calculation or genetic inheritance, relationships that would serve as anchor when he eventually encountered the seductive but poisonous worldview that had shaped his father and abandoned his generation. The manifestation of his cursed technique during moments of crisis provided glimpses of capabilities that would have excited clan elders beyond measure if they had possessed sufficient wisdom to recognize that their own actions had forfeited any claim to guidance or control over his development. The shadows that responded to his emotional state and protective instincts revealed power that operated according to principles of love and responsibility rather than dominance and exploitation, suggesting possibilities that traditional clan approaches had never achieved. The intervention that brought Gojo Satoru into his life represented turning point that would determine whether his extraordinary gifts would be channeled toward construction or destruction, protection or domination, healing or perpetuation of cycles of trauma. that had claimed previous generations. The arrangement that was negotiated to secure his independence from clan control was both practical necessity and moral statement about the difference between strength used in service of others and power wielded for personal advantage. The education that he received at Tokyo Jujutsu High provided exposure to alternative approaches to cursed energy and supernatural combat that emphasized cooperation, mutual support, and the protection of innocent people rather than the systematic exploitation and domination that characterized traditional clan methods. The teachers and classmates who surrounded him during this formative period demonstrated possibilities for using exceptional abilities in service of values that transcended narrow self-interest or tribal loyalty. The friendships that developed during his student years were built upon foundations of mutual respect and genuine affection that had been completely absent from the relationships that governed clan life, creating bonds that were based on shared commitment to protecting others, rather than strategic alliances designed to advance individual position within established hierarchies. The trust that grew between him and his classmates provided psychological support that enabled growth and development that would have been impossible within the isolation and competition that characterized traditional Zenin education. The combat training that refined his technique applications was guided by instructors who understood that true strength came from the willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for the welfare of others, rather than the capacity to impose one's will upon those too weak to resist effectively. The missions that tested his developing capabilities provided practical experience with the difference between using power to protect innocent people and deploying supernatural abilities to maintain systems of oppression and exploitation. The philosophical education that accompanied his technical training exposed him to ethical frameworks that emphasized human dignity, individual worth, and moral obligations that transcended clan loyalty or genetic inheritance. The discussions that occurred during quiet moments between training sessions and missions provided opportunities to explore questions about responsibility, justice, and the proper relationship between exceptional ability and service to common good that had never been addressed within traditional clan education. The encounters with actual clan members that occurred during his development as sorcerer revealed the psychological damage that their system inflicted upon everyone it touched, including those who appeared to benefit from their privileged position within established hierarchies. The cruelty and arrogance that characterized their interactions were not expressions of genuine strength, but symptoms of spiritual poverty that had been cultivated through generations of systematic dehumanization and moral compromise. The pressure that was periodically brought to bear upon him to return to clan control was motivated not by genuine concern for his welfare or desire to provide him with his rightful inheritance, but by recognition that his abilities represented strategic asset that could dramatically enhance their position within Jujutsu society if properly controlled and directed. The negotiations that surrounded these attempts revealed the extent to which clan leadership viewed him as valuable property rather than family member deserving of love and support. The internal conflicts that arose from his connection to people and traditions that he could neither fully embrace nor completely reject created psychological complexity that distinguished him from both ordinary sorcerers and traditional clan heirs who had been raised within more consistent environments. The guilt that accompanied his rejection of clan authority was balanced by awareness that their values and methods were fundamentally incompatible with his own moral development and commitments to protecting, rather than exploiting, others. The technique development that occurred through practical application and innovative experimentation revealed capabilities that exceeded traditional understanding of what the 10 shadows could accomplish when wielded by someone whose motivation was protection rather than domination. The Shikigami that he learned to summon and control responded to his emotional state and moral intentions in ways that suggested deeper connections between supernatural ability and spiritual development than clan theories had ever acknowledged. The relationships with authority figures that developed during his education at Tokyo Jujutsu High provided models for how power could be exercised with wisdom and restraint, rather than arbitrary cruelty and systematic exploitation. The respect that he received from teachers and administrators was based on his demonstrated competence and moral character, rather than his genetic inheritance or potential value as strategic asset, creating psychological foundations that were completely foreign to traditional clan approaches. The romantic interests that began to develop during his adolescence were uncomplicated by the strategic calculations and breeding considerations that governed traditional clan marriages, allowing him to explore emotional connections that were based on genuine affection and mutual compatibility, rather than genetic optimization and political advantage. The freedom to choose his own relationships represented liberation from constraints that had limited previous generations, while creating opportunities for personal growth that transcended narrow clan interests. The missions that tested his abilities against genuinely dangerous opponents provided practical experience with the difference between combat conducted to protect innocent people and violence deployed to maintain systems of oppression and pain, exploitation. The satisfaction that came from successful completion of assignments that served broader social welfare contrasted sharply with the hollow victories that characterized traditional clan approaches to conflict resolution and power projection. The leadership roles that gradually developed as his reputation and capabilities became recognized within Jujutsu society demonstrated possibilities for using exceptional abilities to inspire and guide others, rather than dominating and exploiting subordinates who lacked comparable power. The respect that he earned from peers and colleagues was based on demonstrated competence and moral integrity, rather than inherited status or intimidation tactics that characterized traditional clan methods. The confrontations with clan representatives that became increasingly frequent as his power and independence grew revealed the extent to which their system depended upon control and submission, rather than voluntary cooperation based on shared values and mutual benefit. The attempts to reassert authority over his development and deployment were met with resistance that was both principled and effective, demonstrating that alternatives to traditional hierarchies were not just theoretically possible, but practically achievable. The psychological development that occurred through exposure to healthy relationships and constructive use of exceptional abilities created personality characteristics that were fundamentally incompatible with the clan system that claimed ownership of his genetic inheritance. The empathy, compassion, and moral reasoning that grew through positive experiences and supportive relationships represented everything that traditional clan education was designed to eliminate or suppress in favor of more useful attributes. The strategic thinking that informed his approach to complex challenges reflected understanding that genuine solutions required consideration of long-term consequences and broader social welfare, rather than narrow optimization of personal advantage or clan interests. The plans that he developed for addressing various threats and opportunities demonstrated sophistication that exceeded traditional approaches, while incorporating moral considerations that had been systematically excluded from clan decision-making processes. The public recognition that accompanied his achievements as student and junior sorcerer created reputation that was based on actual accomplishments and demonstrated character rather than inherited status or intimidation tactics that sustained traditional clan influence. The respect that he earned from the broader Jujutsu community represented validation of approaches that emphasized service and protection, rather than domination and exploitation of those who lacked comparable abilities. The curse that hung over his relationship with clan inheritance was not supernatural phenomenon, but psychological burden, created by understanding that his exceptional abilities had been purchased through centuries of systematic cruelty and exploitation that had destroyed countless lives in pursuit of genetic optimization and supernatural power. The guilt that accompanied this knowledge was balanced by determination to use his inherited capabilities in service of values that transcended narrow tribal loyalty and personal advantage. The transformation that he represented within the context of Zenin family history was not mere individual rebellion against traditional authority, but fundamental challenge to assumptions that had governed their approach to power and responsibility for generations. His very existence as capable and moral individual who had developed outside their control demonstrated that their methods were not necessary for producing exceptional results, while suggesting that alternatives might achieve superior outcomes through less destructive means. The future that he envisioned for himself and those he cared about was characterized by possibilities that transcended traditional clan limitations and restrictions, opportunities for growth and development that were based on individual merit and moral character rather than genetic inheritance, and willingness to perpetuate systems of oppression and exploitation. The hope that sustained him through various challenges and conflicts was grounded in understanding that change was both necessary and achievable if sufficient courage and determination could be brought to bear upon entrenched interests and best traditional practices. The legacy that his choices and development would leave for future generations was not predetermined by genetic inheritance or clan traditions, but remained subject to conscious decisions about how exceptional abilities should be used and what values should guide the application of power that could protect or destroy depending upon the moral framework that informed its deployment. The question that would ultimately determine his impact upon the world was whether love could triumph over hatred, protection over exploitation, and wisdom over the accumulated cruelty of ancestors who had chosen power over humanity in pursuit of dominance that had consumed everything it was meant to preserve. The obsession with bloodline purity that had driven Zenin clan practices for centuries was not merely philosophical preference or cultural tradition, but systematic program of genetic manipulation that reduced human beings to breeding stock whose value was measured entirely through their potential contributions to supernatural power concentration within carefully controlled lineages. The marriage arrangements that governed clan reproduction were designed according to principles that would have been familiar to livestock breeders: careful attention to genetic compatibility and cursed energy inheritance patterns that took precedence over every consideration of personal happiness, emotional compatibility, or basic human dignity. The isolation that had characterized clan existence since their establishment in the mountains outside Kyoto was not accidental byproduct of geographical location, but deliberate strategy designed to prevent contamination of their genetic material through exposure to inferior bloodlines that might dilute the supernatural capabilities they had spent generations accumulating and refining. The barriers that separated them from the outside world served multiple purposes, protecting their secrets while ensuring that breeding decisions could be made without interference from external authorities or social conventions that might have imposed moral constraints on their reproductive practices. The women who were born into the clan or married into it through strategic alliances existed within a system that viewed them primarily as vessels for genetic transmission, rather than individuals deserving of autonomy, respect, or consideration for their personal desires and aspirations. The medical examinations that were conducted to evaluate their reproductive potential were invasive and dehumanizing, reducing complex human beings to collections of measurable characteristics that could be catalogued and compared to determine their suitability for producing children with desired supernatural abilities. The record-keeping that documented these breeding programs was meticulous in its attention to genetic relationships and cursed energy inheritance patterns. Detailed charts and genealogies that traced bloodlines across generations while carefully noting the results of various reproductive combinations and their effects on the supernatural capabilities of resulting offspring. The data that was accumulated through these practices provided theoretical foundation for increasingly sophisticated approaches to genetic manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even within their isolated community. The medical knowledge that was developed to support these breeding programs included understanding of human genetics and reproductive biology that exceeded contemporary scientific knowledge in many areas. Practical expertise gained through centuries of experimentation on unwilling subjects who had no choice but to submit to whatever procedures were deemed necessary for advancing clan interests. The physicians who were employed to provide these services were bound by oaths that prioritized clan welfare over individual patient care or medical ethics. The living arrangements within the clan compound were designed to facilitate careful monitoring and control of reproductive behavior, while preventing the formation of emotional bonds that might interfere with strategic breeding decisions made by clan leadership. The private quarters that were assigned to married couples were equipped with observation systems that allowed constant surveillance of intimate relationships, ensuring that no unauthorized reproductive activity could occur without detection and appropriate intervention. The children who resulted from these carefully planned unions were subjected to genetic testing and cursed energy evaluation from their earliest moments, their potential value to clan interests assessed through methods that treated them as investment opportunities, rather than beloved offspring deserving of unconditional love and support. Those who demonstrated exceptional abilities were immediately marked for special treatment and accelerated development programs, while those who showed signs of genetic weakness or inadequate supernatural gifts were relegated to subsidiary roles that reflected their diminished worth within the clan hierarchy. The cousin marriages that became increasingly common as the clan's isolation deepened were not merely accepted practice, but actively encouraged strategy for concentrating desirable genetic traits while eliminating the diluting effects of outside bloodlines. The genetic counseling that preceded these unions was conducted according to principles that prioritized supernatural ability enhancement over the health risks that typically accompanied close inbreeding, creating conditions that increased the likelihood of both exceptional cursed energy development and serious hereditary disorders. The birth defects that inevitably resulted from generations of close inbreeding were either concealed from outside observation or eliminated through methods that reflected the clan's unwillingness to acknowledge the costs of their patient genetic manipulation programs. The children who were born with serious disabilities were often removed from clan records and hidden away in remote areas of the compound, their existence denied to prevent embarrassment or questions about the wisdom of their breeding practices. The psychological disorders that accompanied the physical consequences of inbreeding were similarly concealed or misinterpreted through diagnostic frameworks that attributed mental health problems to individual weakness, rather than systematic genetic damage caused by generations of reproductive practices that violated basic biological principles. The depression, anxiety, and various forms of cognitive impairment that affected many clan members were treated as character defects, requiring discipline rather than medical conditions, requiring treatment and support. The fertility problems that plagued many clan marriages were addressed through increasingly desperate medical interventions that pushed the boundaries of available technology while maintaining absolute secrecy about the procedures and their success rates. The pressure that was placed on women to produce viable heirs created psychological stress that often exacerbated reproductive difficulties, creating cycles of failure and punishment that destroyed marriages and individual mental health. The miscarriages and infant mortality that occurred at rates far exceeding normal populations were attributed to supernatural factors or individual moral failures rather than the predictable consequences of genetic practices that had prioritized power, concentration over biological sustainability. The grief that accompanied these losses was complicated by clan pressures to immediately attempt replacement pregnancies without adequate time for physical or emotional recovery from previous failures. The sexual education that was provided to young clan members focused entirely on reproductive function and genetic optimization, while systematically excluding information about emotional intimacy, mutual pleasure, or relationship dynamics based on affection and compatibility. The instruction that they received treated physical intimacy as biological function rather than expression of love or means of emotional connection between partners who cared about each other's welfare and happiness. The marriage ceremonies that celebrated these strategic unions were elaborate productions designed to demonstrate clan wealth and influence while reinforcing messages about the reproductive obligations that defined the primary purpose of these relationships. The rituals that were performed emphasized themes of genetic continuity and supernatural power transmission rather than love, partnership, or mutual support between individuals who had chosen to share their lives together. The divorce procedures that governed the dissolution of marriages that failed to produce desired offspring were designed to protect clan genetic interests, while ensuring that reproductive resources could be reallocated to more promising combinations. The women who were rejected through these processes often faced social exile or forced remarriage to other clan members who were considered more suitable for their particular genetic contributions and reproductive potential. The adoption practices that were employed when natural reproduction failed to produce adequate heirs involved careful screening of potential candidates from allied families or subordinate bloodlines, genetic testing, and cursed energy evaluation that determined whether outsiders possessed characteristics that might enhance clan capabilities without introducing undesirable traits that could compromise future generations. The contraception methods that were developed to prevent unauthorized pregnancies were sophisticated and effective, ensuring that reproductive decisions remained under strict clan control while preventing the formation of emotional bonds that might complicate strategic breeding plans. The access to these methods was carefully restricted to ensure that only approved sexual relationships could result in pregnancy and childbirth. The prenatal care that was provided during approved pregnancies included monitoring and intervention techniques that were designed to optimize fetal development while identifying potential problems that might affect the supernatural capabilities of resulting children. The procedures that were employed often involved experimental methods that had not been tested for safety or long-term effects on either mothers or developing children. The childcare practices that governed infant and early childhood development were designed to maximize cursed energy potential while minimizing emotional attachment between parents and children that might interfere with clan decisions about education, training, and eventual reproductive assignments. The nurseries that housed young children were staffed by servants rather than family members, preventing the formation of bonds that could complicate future strategic decisions. The genetic research that was conducted to improve breeding outcomes included experimentation with cursed energy manipulation during conception and pregnancy, attempts to artificially enhance supernatural abilities through methods that combined traditional jujutsu techniques with biological intervention. The results of these experiments were carefully documented, but rarely shared outside the small group of clan members who were directly involved in reproductive planning and genetic optimization. The international connections that were maintained with other sorcerer families provided access to additional genetic material that could be incorporated into clan bloodlines through carefully negotiated marriage arrangements. These relationships were entirely strategic, designed to acquire specific supernatural abilities or eliminate hereditary weaknesses while maintaining overall genetic purity and clan identity. The theoretical framework that justified these practices drew upon corrupted interpretations of evolutionary biology and selective breeding principles that ignored the moral and practical problems associated with treating human beings as livestock to be improved through systematic genetic manipulation. The philosophical arguments that were developed to support these approaches combined pseudo-scientific reasoning with traditional clan values in ways that made questioning the system seem both illogical and disloyal. The documentation that recorded the results of generations of controlled breeding provided evidence of both the successes and failures of their approach. Statistical data that revealed the true costs of their genetic manipulation programs in terms of human suffering, health problems, and psychological damage that had been systematically concealed from outside observation. The ultimate irony of these breeding practices was that they had produced individuals like Toji, whose complete lack of cursed energy represented the most devastating possible refutation of their theories about genetic superiority and supernatural inheritance, while simultaneously creating the conditions that would eventually lead to their own destruction through the very mechanisms they had designed to ensure their perpetual dominance. The system had consumed itself from within, producing the instruments of its own annihilation through methods that were supposed to guarantee eternal supremacy. The secret that the clan had guarded most carefully was not the extent of their supernatural abilities or the details of their advanced techniques, but the biological and psychological damage that their breeding practices had inflicted upon generations of family members who had been sacrificed to maintain the illusion of genetic superiority that justified their continued dominance over those they considered inferior. The truth about their reproductive practices was more devastating than any external threat could have been, revealing the fundamental corruption that had transformed human love into genetic calculation and family bonds, into strategic assets to be deployed in service of abstract theories about bloodline purity and inherited power. The afternoon that would forever divide the lives of the Zenin twins into before and after arrived with deceptive normalcy. Autumn sunlight filtering through ancient windows of the compound, while shadows gathered in corners that had witnessed centuries of cruelty disguised as tradition, and love perverted into possession. Mai Zenin moved through the familiar corridors with the careful composure that had become her armor against a world that measured her worth through comparisons to her absent sister, each step calculated to avoid drawing attention that might result in another lecture about her inadequacies or another reminder of how thoroughly Maki had abandoned both family and responsibility in pursuit of selfish dreams. The summons that brought her to the main hall was delivered with the formal courtesy that barely concealed contempt. Servants who had learned to treat her with the minimal respect necessary to avoid direct confrontation, while making clear through countless small gestures that she occupied a position of diminished worth within the hierarchy that governed every aspect of compound life. The message itself was brief and ominous, requiring her presence for discussions about her future role within the family structure now that recent events had created opportunities for advancement that might not be available again. The gathering that awaited her arrival included clan elders whose presence indicated that whatever was to be discussed carried significant weight within their political and strategic calculations, their expressions revealing mixture of calculation and disappointment that had characterized their interactions with both twins since early childhood. The chairs that were arranged for this meeting emphasized hierarchical relationships through positioning and quality, her assigned seat clearly marking her subordinate status, while providing clear sightlines to the authority figures who would determine whatever fate had been prepared for her. The conversation that followed was conducted with the careful diplomatic language that masked brutal realities behind polite formulations and strategic euphemisms, discussions of marriage arrangements, and reproductive obligations that treated her as valuable resource to be deployed rather than person whose preferences and desires might deserve consideration in decisions that would determine the remainder of her existence. The proposals that were presented had been developed through careful analysis of her genetic potential and political usefulness, calculations that reduced her to collections of measurable characteristics. The resistance that she offered to these plans was met with patience that was more threatening than anger would have been. Understanding smiles that indicated her objections had been anticipated and prepared for through methods that would make compliance seem preferable to continued opposition. The alternatives that were outlined with clinical precision made clear that her choices were limited to various forms of submission. The illusion of agency maintained through selection between predetermined options that all served clan interests, while providing minimal consideration for her personal welfare. The mention of Mucky's name during these discussions was carefully calculated to exploit the emotional wounds that had never properly healed. References to her sister's betrayal and abandonment used as psychological pressure to encourage cooperation with arrangements that would demonstrate her superior loyalty and commitment to family values. The comparisons that were drawn between their different choices were designed to highlight Mai's relative virtue, while making clear that such virtue required concrete demonstration through actions rather than mere verbal profession. The pressure that was applied during these negotiations was both subtle and overwhelming, creating psychological atmosphere that made resistance seem both futile and selfish, while compliance appeared to offer opportunities for acceptance and recognition that had been denied throughout her childhood and adolescence. The promises that were made about her future status and treatment within approved marriage arrangements were carefully crafted to address her deepest insecurities, while avoiding commitments that might prove inconvenient if circumstances changed. The internal conflict that this situation created was devastating in its complexity, forcing her to choose between personal autonomy and family loyalty, while understanding that either choice would involve sacrifices that might prove impossible to bear over time. The love that she still felt for her sister was complicated by resentment over abandonment and betrayal, emotions that made clear thinking about available options extremely difficult, while clan representatives applied increasing pressure for immediate decision. The realization that began to crystallize during these discussions was that her compliance with clan expectations had not earned the acceptance and protection she had hoped for, but had instead marked her as a reliable resource that could be deployed without concern for her personal feelings or desires. The years she had spent trying to become what they wanted had not transformed her from burden into beloved family member, but had simply made her useful in ways that her sister's rebellion had rendered impossible. The desperation that grew as her situation became increasingly clear was matched by growing understanding that the path she had chosen in opposition to Maki's rebellion had led to trap that was perhaps more complete and inescapable than anything her sister had faced. The compliance that had seemed like wisdom and maturity was revealed as cowardice that had enabled her own exploitation, while accomplishing nothing positive for either herself or the sister she had claimed to protect through her sacrifice. The breaking point that shattered her carefully maintained composure came when clan representatives made clear that her cooperation with their marriage plans was not request but command, and that resistance would result in consequences that would extend beyond her individual situation to affect other family members who had shown her kindness or support. The threat was delivered with casual confidence that indicated years of experience with similar negotiations and their typical outcomes. The rage that exploded from years of accumulated frustration and disappointment was matched by power that no one in the room had expected from someone they had systematically underestimated and marginalized throughout her development. The curse technique that she had refined in secret during countless hours of solitary practice revealed capabilities that exceeded every assessment that had been made of her potential, construction abilities that could create devastating weapons from minimal cursed energy resources. The violence that erupted during this confrontation was both calculated and desperate. Precise application of accumulated skills, combined with emotional release that had been suppressed for too long under pressure that no individual should have been forced to endure. The clan members who had arranged this meeting discovered that their careful plans had failed to account for possibilities that their own prejudices and assumptions had prevented them from recognizing or preparing to address. The escape that followed was accomplished through combination of superior technique, application, and intimate knowledge of compound layout gained through years of careful observation and strategic preparation that she had never consciously acknowledged, but which had been accumulating in her subconscious mind throughout her period of apparent compliance and submission. The route that she chose avoided areas where resistance would be strongest, while maximizing opportunities for continued movement toward potential exits. The pursuit that developed as clan security forces mobilized to prevent her departure was both expected and insufficient to stop someone who had finally abandoned concerns about consequences or future relationships within the family structure. The techniques that she deployed to discourage followers were lethal in ways that would have been impossible before her emotional breakthrough, power unleashed without the restraints that had previously limited her effectiveness in combat situations. The confrontation with Maki that occurred during her flight from the compound was simultaneously reunion and final argument, sisters meeting after years of separation and misunderstanding to discover that their different paths had led to similar destinations of isolation and pain. The conversation that passed between them was loaded with years of accumulated resentment and hurt feelings, communications that revealed how thoroughly their relationship had been poisoned by circumstances that neither had chosen, but both had been forced to navigate alone. The revelation that she shared about the true nature of their cursed energy situation was delivered with mixture of love and accusation, information that had been hidden from Maki, but which explained aspects of her own limitations and struggles that had never been properly understood. The knowledge that their powers were connected rather than separate created opportunities for resolution that had never existed before, but also highlighted the costs that their separation had imposed on both of their developments. The decision that she made during this final conversation represented completion of journey that had begun with her choice to remain within the clan structure rather than following her sister into uncertain freedom, understanding that neither path had provided safety or happiness, but that combined their experiences might offer possibilities that had never been available to either of them individually. The sacrifice that she prepared to make was both gift and expiation, attempt to provide Maki with capabilities that had always existed in potential, but which circumstances had prevented from manifesting. The technique that she employed to transfer her cursed energy reserves to her sister was not traditional method, but innovation born from desperation and love, understanding of their unique situation that allowed manipulation of spiritual forces in ways that conventional Jujutsu theory claimed were impossible. The process was agonizing and irreversible, conscious choice to eliminate her own supernatural abilities in order to enhance Maki's potential beyond anything that had ever been achieved through normal development. The final words that passed between them before the transfer was completed were attempts to communicate feelings that had been suppressed and distorted by years of separation and misunderstanding, expressions of love that had survived despite everything that had conspired to destroy the bond between them. The forgiveness that they offered each other was both complete and inadequate, recognition that their individual choices had been constrained by circumstances that neither had created but both had been forced to endure. The death that concluded Mai's existence was peaceful in ways that contrasted sharply with the violence and suffering that had characterized most of her life, consciousness fading gradually as her spiritual energy flowed into her sister's body and transformed both of them into something new and unprecedented. The smile that remained on her face after life departed reflected satisfaction and relief that had been denied throughout her years of struggle and compromise. The transformation that occurred within Maki as this transfer completed was both physical and psychological, capabilities that had been suppressed by their shared cursed energy situation, finally achieving full expression while memories and emotions from Mai's experiences provided context and motivation that had been missing from her. Individual development. The power that she gained was not merely technical enhancement, but spiritual completion that had been prevented by circumstances neither sister had understood. The legacy that Mai's sacrifice created was not measured in enhanced combat capabilities or expanded technique repertoires, but in the love that had finally found expression through ultimate gift, demonstration that human connection could transcend even the most determined efforts to destroy it through systematic oppression and manipulation. The greatest victory over the clan's toxic values was not achieved through violence or rebellion, but through love that proved stronger than hatred, sacrifice that chose giving over taking, connection over isolation. The memorial that would exist in Maki's heart and actions represented everything that Mai had hoped to become but had been prevented from achieving through circumstances beyond her control. Idealized version of strength and wisdom that could guide future choices while honoring memory of someone whose potential had been wasted by system that viewed people as resources rather than individuals deserving of love and opportunity. For growth and self-determination, the transformation that began coursing through Maki's body in the moments following Mai's ultimate sacrifice was not merely enhancement of existing capabilities, but fundamental rewriting of her relationship with physical reality itself. The cursed energy that had been divided between two souls finally achieving complete concentration within a single vessel whose potential had been constrained since birth by circumstances neither sister had understood. The power that flooded through her nervous system was accompanied by sensations that transcended normal categories of human experience, awareness expanding beyond individual consciousness to encompass something approaching divine perception of the forces that governed existence itself. The first breath that she drew after the transfer completed carried oxygen that seemed charged with possibilities that had never existed before, her lungs processing air with efficiency that exceeded normal biological parameters, while her heart pumped blood that carried enhanced cursed energy to every cell in her body. The physical changes that accompanied this spiritual transformation were subtle but profound, muscle density increasing, while reflexes sharpened to levels that approached supernatural perception and response capabilities that had been theoretical until this moment of crystallization. The memories that flooded her consciousness were not merely Mai's final thoughts, but complete emotional and experiential record of her sister's existence. Years of pain and struggle and compromise that provided context for understanding the true nature of their family's corruption and the costs that systematic oppression had imposed upon everyone it touched. The knowledge that she gained through this sharing was both devastating and liberating. Truth that explained behaviors and choices that had seemed incomprehensible when viewed from the perspective of incomplete information. The rage that built within her as these revelations achieved full integration was not sudden explosion, but slowly rising tide of fury that had been accumulating for years, but which now possessed focus and purpose that transformed diffuse anger into precision instrument of justice and retribution. The clan members who had orchestrated Mai's suffering and death had created their own nemesis through methods that were supposed to ensure their continued dominance, but which had instead forged weapons that would prove perfectly suited for their destruction. The compound that had been her prison during childhood and adolescence suddenly revealed itself as a collection of obstacles and targets, rather than impregnable fortress. Her enhanced perception, identifying structural weaknesses and defensive limitations that could be exploited by someone who possessed sufficient power and determination to implement a comprehensive assault plan. The buildings that had seemed imposing and permanent were transformed into temporary arrangements of wood and stone that could be dismantled by someone who no longer feared consequences or retribution. The weapons that she selected for her campaign of destruction were not exotic cursed tools or supernatural implements, but simple instruments that could be enhanced through perfect technique application and overwhelming physical capability, that rendered traditional defensive measures inadequate for addressing threats they had never been designed to counter. The staff that became her primary weapon was an ordinary piece of wood that achieved legendary status through the precision and power with which it was wielded against opponents who discovered that conventional advantages meant nothing against absolute determination. The first encounters with clan security forces revealed both the effectiveness of her transformation and the psychological impact that her new capabilities had upon people who had spent their entire lives believing that their supernatural abilities made them superior to ordinary humans and immune to genuine challenge from those they considered inferior. The shock that registered on their faces when their techniques proved inadequate was matched by terror that came from recognizing that their victim had become their judge and executioner. The systematic elimination of clan leadership that followed was conducted with methodical efficiency that reflected both tactical planning and moral purpose. Each death carefully orchestrated to serve both practical objectives and symbolic significance that would communicate clear messages about the consequences of systematic cruelty and exploitation. The methods that she employed were designed to be both swift and memorable, demonstrations of power that would be discussed and remembered long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The servants and retainers who had enabled clan operations through their willingness to participate in systems of oppression were offered opportunities for surrender and departure that were more generous than anything their former employers had ever provided to those who sought mercy or consideration. The distinction that she drew between active perpetrators and passive enablers reflected moral sophistication that had been absent from clan decision-making processes for generations. Recognition that justice required discrimination between levels of culpability and responsibility. The children and non-combatants who were present during her assault were systematically protected and evacuated, despite the tactical complications that such considerations created for her operational planning. Demonstration that her transformation had enhanced rather than eliminated the compassion and protective instincts that had always characterized her approach to power and responsibility. The care that she took to minimize collateral damage revealed that her methods were guided by principles rather than simple desire for revenge or destruction. The ancestral halls that contained records and artifacts documenting centuries of clan history and tradition were methodically destroyed, not from ignorance or vandalism, but from understanding that these materials served primarily to justify and perpetuate systems of oppression that had caused immeasurable suffering while producing nothing of genuine value for human civilization. The flames that consumed these documents were both practical necessity and symbolic statement about the need to eliminate ideological foundations that supported institutional cruelty. The private quarters that housed clan leadership were searched and demolished, with particular attention to discovering and destroying evidence of the breeding programs and genetic manipulation that had reduced human beings to livestock, while creating conditions that had made tragedies like Mai's death inevitable. The documentation that was uncovered revealed depths of systematic dehumanization that exceeded even pessimistic estimates about the extent of their corruption and moral failure. The confrontation with Naoya that served as climactic battle of her campaign was both personal vendetta and symbolic confrontation between competing philosophies about power and responsibility, his arrogance and sense of entitlement meeting her fury and moral clarity in combat that would determine whether traditional hierarchies could survive challenge from those they had oppressed. The techniques that he deployed represented centuries of refined clan methodology, while her responses demonstrated what such methods could accomplish when guided by love rather than hatred. The speed advantage that had made him legendary among clan combatants proved inadequate against someone whose physical capabilities had transcended normal limitations, while her tactical awareness allowed anticipation and counter-planning that neutralized his primary strategic assets. The confidence that had sustained him throughout his development as perfect heir was systematically dismantled through demonstration that superior breeding and traditional training were insufficient preparation for confronting genuine, moral authority backed by overwhelming power. The death that concluded their battle was neither quick nor merciful, but proportional to the suffering that his actions and attitudes had caused throughout his life. Justice that reflected both personal accountability and symbolic significance as representative of everything toxic about the system that had created and nurtured him. The final moments of his existence were characterized by understanding that his supposed superiority had been illusion, maintained through exploitation of those who lacked power to resist effectively. The elder council members who had orchestrated clan policies and perpetuated traditional practices were eliminated through methods that reflected their specific contributions to the systematic oppression that had claimed Mai's life and countless others throughout the generations, their deaths serving both practical and educational purposes for anyone who might survive to learn from their example. The fear that characterized their final moments was appropriate response to recognition that their victims had finally acquired means to hold them accountable for their choices. The compound structures that had housed these operations were systematically demolished, not from random destructiveness, but from understanding that physical spaces could embody and perpetuate toxic relationships and power dynamics that would continue to influence behavior long after individual perpetrators had been eliminated. The architecture that had reinforced hierarchical relationships through spatial organization needed to be destroyed to prevent future repetition of similar patterns. The treasures and artifacts that represented accumulated clan wealth were either destroyed or redistributed according to principles that prioritized restitution for past victims over preservation of cultural heritage that primarily served to glorify oppression and exploitation. The gold and cursed objects that had been hoarded through centuries of extraction were transformed from symbols of power into resources for healing and reconstruction. The libraries and archives that contained technical knowledge and historical records were evaluated according to their potential contributions to human welfare versus their role in perpetuating harmful ideologies and practices. Useful information preserved, while materials that served primarily to justify cruelty and exploitation were eliminated. The discrimination that she exercised in these decisions reflected wisdom that had been absent from clan leadership for generations. The medical facilities that had been used to support breeding programs and genetic experimentation were completely destroyed, along with all equipment and records that might enable future repetition of such practices. Recognition that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve and some capabilities too corrupting to maintain. The physicians who had participated in these programs were held accountable for their contributions to systematic dehumanization through methods that reflected the suffering they had inflicted upon unwilling subjects. The aftermath of her campaign left the compound in ruins that would serve as monument to the consequences of choosing power over humanity, dominance over love, tradition over justice. Visual reminder that even the most established systems could be dismantled when their victims acquired sufficient strength and determination to demand accountability. The silence that settled over the devastated buildings was more complete than death. Absence of the cruelty and suffering that had characterized the location for centuries. The survivors who had been spared through her mercy were left to contemplate the ruins of everything they had believed about their superiority and entitlement, forced to confront the reality that their power had been maintained through violence and exploitation, rather than natural authority or divine mandate. The psychological impact of witnessing complete destruction of their worldview was perhaps more devastating than physical death would have been. The transformation that she had undergone through Mai's sacrifice and her own actions had created something unprecedented in Jujutsu history. Individual whose power was matched by moral clarity and whose capabilities were guided by love rather than hatred, protection rather than domination, justice rather than revenge. The legend that would grow from these events would inspire future generations while serving as warning about the consequences of systematic oppression. The peace that settled over her spirit as the immediate crisis concluded was not satisfaction of completed revenge, but relief that comes from finally being able to act according to principles that had been suppressed throughout years of powerlessness and frustration. The strength that Mai's love had provided was not burden to be carried, but gift to be used in service of values that transcended individual pain and extended toward universal human dignity. The future that stretched before her was not predetermined by past trauma, but open to possibilities that had been created through destruction of systems that had constrained human potential while perpetuating cycles of abuse and exploitation. The choice that remained was whether the power she had gained would be used to build something better than what had been destroyed, or whether the cycle of violence would continue through different methods towards similar outcomes. Question that only time and continued moral development could answer definitively. The silence that descended upon the ruins of the Zenin compound in the aftermath of Maki's devastating campaign was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow emptiness that follows the complete annihilation of institutional structures that had defined reality for everyone who had lived within their influence for generations. The smoke that rose from demolished buildings carried with it the ashes of traditions and practices that had seemed immutable only hours before, their destruction so complete that even the survivors struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had been erased from existence through systematic application of power guided by moral purpose rather than strategic calculation. The few clan members who had escaped the immediate destruction found themselves wandering through a world that had been fundamentally altered, not just in its physical characteristics, but in its basic assumptions about how power functioned and what consequences might follow from the systematic oppression of those deemed inferior by accident of birth or circumstance. The psychological disorientation that accompanied this realization was perhaps more devastating than the material losses, forcing radical reconstruction of worldviews that had been shaped by centuries of unchallenged supremacy and entitlement. The servants and retainers who had enabled clan operations through their willing participation in systems of exploitation were left to confront their own complicity in maintaining structures that had caused immeasurable suffering while providing them with economic security and social status that had seemed worth the moral compromises required for continued employment. The freedom that came with the collapse of their institutional framework was accompanied by terror at the prospect of existing without the hierarchical relationships that had defined their identities and purposes. The broader Jujutsu community that learned of these events through carefully filtered reports and eyewitness accounts struggled to process implications that extended far beyond the fate of a single family, understanding that the precedent established through Maki's actions represented fundamental challenge to assumptions about traditional authority and the natural order that had governed their society since its earliest foundations. The discussions that followed in meeting halls and private conversations revealed fault lines and tensions that had been suppressed but never resolved. The political ramifications of the Zenin clan's destruction rippled through networks of alliance and obligation that had been carefully constructed over centuries to maintain stability and continuity within Jujutsu society. Their sudden absence, creating power vacuums and opportunities for realignment that would reshape relationships between remaining families and organizations for generations to come. The balance of forces that had seemed permanent was revealed as temporary arrangement that could be altered through sufficient application of determination and capability. The economic consequences of eliminating one of the three great families affected resource distribution and financial relationships that extended far beyond supernatural communities into ordinary business and political networks where clan influence had been exercised through carefully concealed channels and proxy organizations. The wealth that had been accumulated through centuries of exploitation was scattered or destroyed, creating both opportunities for redistribution and instabilities that would require time and effort to resolve constructively. The ideological impact of demonstrating that even the most established hierarchies could be dismantled through individual action inspired some observers, while terrifying others who recognized that their own positions might be vulnerable to similar challenges if circumstances aligned to produce another individual with comparable power and motivation. The example that Maki had set could not be contained or forgotten, becoming part of cultural memory that would influence future generations' understanding of what was possible. The investigation that was conducted by Jujutsu authorities into the events that had led to the clan's destruction revealed evidence of systematic abuse and corruption that had been concealed from outside observation for generations. Documentation of practices that exceeded even pessimistic assumptions about the extent of their moral failures and institutional dysfunction. The reports that were produced provided justification for Maki's actions while raising uncomfortable questions about how such conditions had been allowed to persist without intervention. The legal framework that governed relationships between sorcerer families proved inadequate for addressing circumstances that had never been anticipated by those who had established traditional procedures and protocols, creating precedents and interpretations that would reshape understanding of individual rights and collective responsibilities within their community. The principles that emerged from these deliberations emphasized accountability and human dignity over traditional deference to established authority and inherited status. The educational implications of these events forced reconsideration of curricula and methods that had emphasized technical training and institutional loyalty over moral development and critical thinking that might have prevented the systematic dehumanization that had characterized clan operations. The reforms that were implemented in response prioritized character formation and ethical reasoning alongside traditional instruction in cursed energy manipulation and combat techniques. The medical community that had served Jujutsu society was forced to confront evidence of colleagues who had participated in breeding programs and genetic experimentation that violated fundamental principles of healthcare ethics and human dignity, leading to professional accountability measures and revised standards that prohibited such practices, while establishing oversight mechanisms to prevent future occurrences of similar abuses. The religious and philosophical communities that had provided spiritual guidance and moral instruction to sorcerer families were compelled to examine their own complicity in maintaining ideological frameworks that had justified systematic oppression and exploitation of vulnerable individuals, leading to theological reforms and renewed emphasis on teachings about universal human worth and moral obligations that transcended tribal loyalties and traditional hierarchies. The international relationships that connected Japanese Jujutsu society with similar communities in other nations were affected by the revelation that one of their most prestigious families had been engaged in practices that exceeded acceptable standards even within cultures that maintained their own forms of supernatural hierarchy and social stratification. The diplomatic consequences included both condemnation of past practices and increased scrutiny of current policies and procedures. The historical scholarship that had celebrated clan achievements and contributions was forced to undergo radical revision as evidence emerged about the true costs of their successes and the methods that had been employed to maintain their position within Jujutsu society, leading to more honest and comprehensive accounts that acknowledged both accomplishments and failures while providing balanced perspectives on their legacy and impact. The psychological support systems that were established to help survivors process trauma and adapt to life outside the institutional structures that had defined their existence required innovative approaches that addressed forms of abuse and conditioning that exceeded normal therapeutic experience and training. The healing that was necessary involved not just individual recovery, but cultural transformation that would prevent repetition of similar patterns in different contexts. The memorial efforts that were undertaken to honor victims of clan practices and preserve memory of their suffering faced complex challenges in determining appropriate forms of remembrance that would serve educational purposes without perpetuating cycles of hatred and revenge that might undermine efforts to build more just and humane institutions to replace those that had been destroyed. The reconstruction projects that were initiated to address immediate practical needs of displaced individuals and disrupted communities required careful coordination between multiple organizations and agencies while ensuring that new structures would embody different values and relationships than those that had been eliminated through Maki's campaign of destruction and moral reckoning. The cultural production that emerged in response to these events included artistic and literary works that attempted to process meanings and implications that extended beyond immediate political and social consequences toward deeper questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the possibilities for redemption and transformation that might emerge from even the most devastating forms of institutional collapse and personal trauma. The security measures that were implemented to prevent future occurrences of systematic abuse within sorcerer families included oversight mechanisms and accountability systems that balanced respect for traditional autonomy with recognition that individual rights and human dignity required protection that transcended clan loyalty and familial authority. When conflicts arose between competing values and obligations, the research initiatives that were established to study factors that had contributed to clan corruption and develop strategies for preventing similar problems in other contexts revealed complex interactions between isolation, unchecked power, traditional beliefs, and psychological factors that created conditions conducive to systematic dehumanization and moral failure among individuals and institutions. The question that remained unresolved as immediate crisis management gave way to longer-term reconstruction efforts was whether the destruction of the Zenin clan represented isolated incident that could be contained and managed through specific reforms and adjustments, or whether it indicated fundamental problems within Jujutsu society that would require more comprehensive transformation to address adequately and permanently. The survivors who had witnessed the complete collapse of everything they had believed about power, authority, and social order were left to construct new identities and relationships that could provide meaning and purpose without repeating the patterns of exploitation and abuse that had characterized their previous existence. A challenge that required both individual courage and collective support from communities that were themselves struggling to understand and adapt to changing circumstances. The legacy that would ultimately emerge from these events depended not just on immediate responses and crisis management, but on sustained commitment to values and principles that could guide future development toward outcomes that honored both the memory of victims and the hope for transformation that had motivated those who had suffered and died to create possibilities for justice and human dignity that had previously seemed impossible to achieve. The silence that had initially seemed empty and final gradually revealed itself as pregnant with possibilities that had been suppressed but not eliminated by generations of systematic oppression, potential for growth and development that could flourish if nurtured with wisdom and care by those who had learned from the mistakes and tragedies of the past, while remaining committed to building something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. And so we close the chapter on a bloodline that chose tradition over compassion, power over love, and dominance over the simple recognition that all human beings deserve dignity, regardless of the circumstances of their birth or the limitations of their abilities. The Zenin clan's tragedy was not written in the stars, but carved by countless choices that prioritize supremacy over service, breeding programs over basic humanity, and the preservation of ancient privileges over the cultivation of wisdom that might have guided their extraordinary gifts toward purposes worthy of the sacrifices demanded to obtain them. In the gentle darkness that embraces us now, we remember not just the perpetrators of systematic cruelty, but the victims whose potential was squandered, whose love was rejected, whose courage, in the face of impossible circumstances, illuminated possibilities for redemption that remained unrealized until it was too late for healing to occur through methods less devastating than complete destruction. Mai's sacrifice and Maki's transformation remind us that even the most corrupted systems contain seeds of their own transcendence, that love can survive attempts to poison it, and that justice, though delayed, need not be denied to those with sufficient strength and moral clarity to demand accountability from those who have wielded power without wisdom or restraint. Rest now, weary souls, knowing that even the darkest legacies can teach us the value of choosing compassion over conquest, and that the strongest among us are measured not by their ability to dominate, but by their willingness to protect what is precious in this world from forces that would destroy it for temporary advantage or inherited pride.